It'll be no surprise to you that throughout 2025, the data have shown once again that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the trends have also borne that out in the holiday shopping period as well. So what is behind this big buzzword that you're hearing around right now of the K-shaped economy? I mean, it's always been the case that wealthy households, they aren't checking their bank balances when they want to go out for a meal to see if they can afford it or not. They're checking their portfolios. And when the Fed keeps interest rates high to fight inflation, it actually hands a win to the top 10%. And the top 10% own 63% of the assets in the United States. And higher rates mean higher yields on their cash and steady appreciation of their homes. And so for this group, inflation is a rounding error. Their paycheck comes from the market, and the market is doing pretty well. For the bottom 50%, the math is brutal. They own just 5% of the assets and carry the bulk of the floating rate debt, the type of debt where it can go up. You know, you don't just sign on the bottom line and you have one rate. And so for them, at like a 2% jump in grocery prices isn't just a statistic. It is meaningful. It can really hurt. And this is where the kind of global feedback loop kicks in. So let's take a look at how kind of multinational brands are pivoting. Whether you're talking about LVMH in Paris or Target in Ohio, the strategy has split. Companies have stopped trying to sell to a middle class that no longer has like one kind of commonality between them, but rather they're bifurcating their business models. Premium prestige tiers on the one side for the asset class and the value tiers for the paycheck earners. In a globalized world, of course, capital is mobile and labor is local. If you own the capital, the stocks, the real estate, the IP, you're plugged into a global growth engine that ignores local inflation. If you only own your labor, you're trapped in a local market where your rent and your heating bill are dictated by global supply shocks that you can't control. Now, we aren't seeing just a weak economy or a strong economy. It's a kind of a structural divorce if you read into the theory of the K-shaped economy. The top 10% are living in a global asset boom and the bottom 50% are living in a local debt trap. And the irony is that some of the policy tools that are intended to fix the economy for the many often end up helping actually the portfolios of the few. One of the most insightful analysts on this topic is Joe Chastain from Retail Next, who can tie it all together with all of the real-world data. And our conversation got into why we're in this situation, the tactics companies are using to appeal to both sides of this split, and whether an economy based on such an enormous wealth gap can continue for much longer. So here it is, my conversation with Joe Chastain. So Joe, looking at all of this, I'm wondering, are we even in a consumer-driven economy anymore? It looks like a portfolio-driven economy. Like GDP is starting to behave like it's a bet on the stock market and real estate, or is that going too far?
I mean, I do definitely agree that, at this point with what we've been seeing, the top wealth distribution, right, they're not feeling the effects that we're seeing nearly, for the majority of the country, especially within the United States, in purchasing and inflation, definitely going back over a year at this time. So, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think from what we see when we're kind of talking about more mass retail, not necessarily just luxury high-end retail, we do see those declines, and they've been consistent over time from both a traffic and a sales standpoint, just showcasing that, for that, lower 50 percentile of the wealth distribution, that there are those extra constraints on their wallets, and it's driving them to make different decisions than they otherwise would have if, the economy was booming as a couple of years ago, or just out of COVID, when things were really starting to get back to normal and things were changing for the consumer then.
Okay, and from your perspective, obviously you look at all of this from a retail angle, which is very important. But do you see in your data a hollowing out of the middle class in terms of spending habits, and also who retailers are actually trying to aim for?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, it's tough to say hollowing out of the middle class necessarily in that way, but I think we do definitely see kind of the split, right? At the top end, there's not really that impact that we see in maybe the luxury market. Yes, there is a little bit of a decline in the luxury, but it's not for the same reasons that we might be seeing for kind of our more mass retail, our more kind of regular price, lower priced options there. We do see more of an influence of the kind of outlet centers or those off-price retailers performing much better more recently and than we've been seeing, just as those customers have been looking for the best deal. There was success on Black Friday with some of the deep discounts and some of the lead into Black Friday with getting customers to get out to stores and to actually make purchases. Even though we did see some declines compared to the prior years from a traffic standpoint, we saw very strong sales, in particular on Black Friday, as those customers, as you potentially mentioned, with, the increased costs for groceries. We've seen massive inflation in grocery costs, those staple goods. That's having an impact, even though to this point, while inflation is up in kind of our retail goods and cost of goods is going up for those consumers, it's really the impact of those staple goods and those grocery items, those things that you really can't get around purchasing, that is really driving some of the changes that we're seeing in consumer behavior. And as we get into Black Friday and kind of the rest of the Christmas time period with holiday shopping, consumers are expecting to be spending less this year on gifts than they did last year. And last year, they also were expecting to spend less on gifts than they were the year before. So it's that continuing, impact of inflation and those constraints on an individual's wallet that has just been driving some of the changes that we've been seeing and where consumers are shopping and which of those brands have been really successful over time.
Oh, Joe, I don't know if you are much of a TikToker, but when I've been on TikTok, just swiping through, you see occasionally some people they're going out and saying, look, I'm here in the mall, I'm shopping and I'm buying stuff. And one thing just hit me. There's someone who's looking like the prices are crazy. And look, it's all polyester, it's all acrylic. Where are the natural fibers and things? Are retailers starting to bring the quality of their products down in order to try and get a bit more margins out of customers who may not be able to spend as much as they were before?
I think we've been kind of seeing that anyway with, the rise of fast fashion and kind of driving a little bit more of, retail recently. I think that's definitely been a factor, but I think as we especially see with the increased tariffs and things that will be going on with, products that are going to be sold there, I think that's definitely going to be making an impact on things. But I don't necessarily know if that's, a trend recent to the last year or two, right? Things have been changing from retail for a long time with, trying to get that more kind of fast fashion option, right? Providing more options to people, the online retail space as well, driving some of that. So yeah, I definitely think that's a factor, but not necessarily maybe within the last year or two, as inflation has been driving up. I think it's been also kind of a longer term trend where we've been seeing some of this really be impacting the stores that are successful and kind of what consumers are purchasing.
Okay, and with this K widening, is there a point where it hits a wall where the people on the lower end can't afford to spend more, that they can't get into further debt, and that the people at the top end, their spending isn't making up for that? How do you see, where's that going?
Yeah, I definitely think that can be the case. To some degree with what the kind of lower end of the income distribution or purchasing, we've already been seeing that, right? The surveys are saying they're not purchasing as much. When they are purchasing, they have to spend more on that item. So that's all been going down. And I think especially too, while the stock market is doing fairly well, I think there are still some concerns about, the potential if there is another bubble in maybe the AI space as well. So there are some other concerns around how that might be impacting things. I think if things continue, well in the stock market, I don't necessarily know if we would see that. But again, there's not going to be enough spending, especially for the retailers that will be mainly purchased, or the items that mainly be purchased by the higher end wealth distribution will not really be propping up those kind of middle tier or even kind of the more budget price retailers that we're seeing kind of benefit right now from some of the increases of inflation and those increased constraints on consumers' wallets.
So I think that kind of part of the read through of this, tell me if I'm wrong, is not necessarily just that, or not necessarily at all, that for businesses that the non-wealthy, let's say, stop being customers, but rather that they stop being profitable customers, or that they have to take more significant actions to keep them profitable. Is that a right interpretation?
I think we've seen that, yeah, to some degree, we've seen that even just with the increased discounting that we've had, right? And sometimes even to some degree, there was discussions around how much of tariffs were even going to be pushed down to consumers and how quickly. I think we've gotten to a point where maybe those tariffs have been pushed down to consumers more, but there was a considerable amount of time through 2025 where tariffs were not being pushed into consumers. Some of the retailers were kind of eating those costs to kind of drive, some of the continued loyalty from customers as well. So as long as that happens, that may continue to help. But I think as those tariff costs continue to get pushed down, if they continue to drive those increased costs, then there will be a definite impact on that bottom end of the distribution customer. And like you said, that top end is not going to be able to fill it out. So even at that top end, while where discounting isn't as big of a factor, that will still have an impact, especially as we see uncertainty in the stock market and things change, a little volatility with the AI boom right now.
So where are the flashing lights on your dashboard? Either what you're concerned about with now or what you'll be looking out for to say, I'm worried about where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think as of right now, there's nothing exceptionally worrisome that I'm seeing. I think from my perspective, and when we're analyzing retail trends and traffic into stores, we are still seeing fairly stable trends. Yes, they are declining, but we've been seeing declines in brick and mortar traffic for a couple of years now, outside of the boom that we got just after COVID and all the shutdown with people going back to stores. So I think things have been fairly stable, but it's kind of that slow declines that we've been seeing as people are making maybe more minor adjustments, kind of tighter adjustments around things. It's not dramatic changes that we're seeing that, it's really just going to be one day we're falling off a cliff. It's more kind of those subtle adjustments and decisions that consumers are making that are kind of leading to the trends that we've been seeing. So I further do expect kind of consistency of what we've been seeing kind of throughout 2025 into 2026 with those more moderate declines. Typically from a traffic standpoint, we've been seeing traffic declining by about 3 percentage points compared to last year. So, again, not something great, but not something that is wholly unexpected either.
You mean footfall in stores then?
Footfall in stores, yes, exactly.
And so is that being picked up by online in any sense?
To some degree, yes, online. Especially there was some research going on too around where those bottom 50% of the wealth income or wealth distribution, where are they purchasing from? We have seen more of a shift of them into more buy online options. We're also seeing even more the buy now, pay later options being a huge factor, especially around Black Friday, but even still kind of in the holidays. So those things have been really a factor recently for consumers to kind of maintain that they can, get their holiday shopping done and, continue to make those purchases.
Okay, now tell me if this is not an area that you normally look at, but is there a geographic difference? Like, are people in cities spending very differently or perhaps more resilient than people in rural areas?
Yeah.
Or is it quite evenly distributed?
That's a great question. So we did look at this, generally speaking, and for the most part, it is kind of a national area. Yes, there will be certain areas where, when, like you mentioned, right, more stock market based incomes are going to be, at least for now, doing considerably better. So, there's going to be some benefits there, but it is kind of an across the board. All regions of the US are showing similar trends of those declines and those concerns that things are not necessarily going to be improving into 2026. I think that's the other thing too. If there was a lot of optimism leading into 2026, that could potentially lead to maybe a trend break in some of what we've been seeing from a spending and a traffic standpoint. But I think a lot of the research that's been conducted, especially more recently, is showing that people are expecting things to be either about the same or potentially even degrade a little bit more into 2026 from both a pricing standpoint. One positive that we have seen, though, is that people do tend to feel fairly secure in their job status. I know that right around Black Friday, there was a report that there was some mass layoffs, but I think we got some recent jobs numbers that were pretty positive for the last month as well. So I think if there's not kind of more mass layoffs, especially maybe the tech sector or kind of, outside of that as well, that will definitely help leading into 2026 and helping to maybe drive some optimism and room for growth. But at this time, I think, my expectation is kind of just consistency with what we've been seeing, that kind of slow decline compared to the last couple of years where traffic is down. People are being more explicit intentional with their purchases, right? Advertising isn't going to work as much to drive consumers to make an impulse purchase. It's going to be much more important to engage effectively with shoppers when they're in individual brand stores and be able to show them the value, right? Whether it's either the price, whether it's the quality, those different aspects are going to be what people are really focused on when they're making those purchases, because they're really coming educated about what they're looking for and not just coming in just to generally shop. They're being very intentional with what they're trying to shop for.
Okay, just kind of an out there question, but what is the difficulty that comes along when you see more and more people shopping using AI tools? Because it means that you don't have your storefront. It is more difficult to upsell. It is harder for you to use all of the normal advertising tools that you have to link people into your store if their preference is going to be. It might not be yet, but certainly it will pick up step by step, shopping through Google Gemini or ChatGPT or this kind of thing. Are retailers, should they be nervous about the trend for shopping through AI, which certainly these companies are trying to gin up?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of a new frontier a little bit, right, with how that's going to work. I know more recently, the big factor has been kind of around the social influence, right, and making sure you have, right, the TikTok influencers, the Instagram influencers really focusing on kind of brands and being brand ambassadors to kind of drive that. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that's going to be an important factor. And those retailers that are ahead of the game and kind of figuring out the right way to optimize AI and make sure that they're able to generate and get their products in front of consumers who are willing to use that. I still, it's fairly early for that. So I think it's about retailers getting out ahead of the game there and kind of using those strategies that maybe they've started to develop with those brand ambassadors and what they've learned from the TikTok space, from Instagram space, trying to drive some value there. But yeah, it is definitely something that brands need to be aware of as that just definitely going to be changing the market even more and potentially even adding more competition for them too, because it's all going to be in one potential spot rather than just going to an individual brand's website and purchasing there. It's going to be all potential options for a certain type of product that a consumer is looking for.
Okay. And then finally, looking ahead, you touched on this a little bit when you talked about stable jobs figures and this kind of thing, but what needs to happen for retail, or let's say for the K to close, for this kind of wealth gap and the difference in how retailers are having to appeal to them to close, and for retail numbers in general to improve, because there's been a lot of question marks over consumer sentiment and whether a lot of the headline figures are actually just on the top end of things and that most consumers have actually been reducing their spending. So what needs to happen in order to see retail go up and a positive trend in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might sound easy, but it's basically just prices need to kind of come down, and not necessarily prices for, the retailers that we focus on, which are typically in kind of specialty retail, apparel, footwear, jewelry, those sorts of categories, but is more your core staple goods prices, right? I think a lot of the research that shows that people see that grocery costs are up, and that's having a major impact on what they're able to purchase kind of more, outside of those core goods. You need food, so you may not necessarily need that new shirt, that new shoe, right? You can maybe last a couple months longer with it. So that's really going to be what's driving and what can start to drive a little bit more of the improvement there. And then I do think, right, we did see some success around Black Friday with the heavy discounting. Of course, that's those heavy discounts that we're going to see is not going to be kind of a year-long staple. But I think where brands can be effective in really showcasing the value of what you're getting for the price. And like you said, maybe if it is kind of returning a little bit more to quality, that's going to be a benefit too, to hopefully maybe drive it. But I think ultimately it just comes down to price. I think consumer sentiment, at least from a job standpoint, as I mentioned, is not too bad, but just the positive outlook is just not really there heading into 2026. I think it really just comes down to what people see when they go to the grocery store, and those prices going up, that's just taking out a huge chunk or a larger chunk of their budget than they had originally been planning for.
You've been watching a sneak preview of our podcast, The Dip, and if you want to subscribe and watch full episodes, just scan the QR code that's on your screen right now or tap the link in the description.